Have we got you there, Chris?
Well, I'm here. In myself.
There you go. Let's wait a couple of minutes. Oh, we might make a start if that's all right. So thanks everyone for joining. I'm Nick Berry. I'm founder and CEO of Seed Terminator here at the Lonsdale factory, where we do a lot of R&D and manufacturing of the Seed Terminator. And today we've got the privilege of having Professor Chris Preston join us, who's a expert in weed science at the University of Adelaide as part of the weed science group there. And Chris has actually been counting some weeds this week, part of it with part of the research that we do with them. And how's that been going, Chris?
Well, I did a calculation. I think we got up to 40,000 ryegrass plants we counted in the last week. So there's a lot of ryegrass out there, Nick, in those samples of yours.
Yeah, so we're testing the boundary conditions of some of our new technology, and unfortunately that means a lot of counting, but really appreciate the work. I was actually thinking about the first time we was the first time we collaborated. It wasn't the first time we met, but the first time we collaborated as part of Seed Terminator. And Chris is actually a key part of how we started. So I had this mill design that I knew that I could mechanically drive and fit to smaller combines. And I met with Chris at the University of Adelaide and was trying to work out how to test these things. And he introduced me to a much more simple way of doing testing, which involved subsampling the total sample of chaff processed, which actually revolutionised how we did it, and it meant that we could get results within weeks instead of months and years. And so it was sort of July 2016, I think we met, and within a month and a half we had results from Roseworthy and kickstarted the company. And yeah, so big thank you for that, Chris.
Oh, no, I'm always happy to help when it comes to weeds.
So I guess on that note, Chris, I was a bit keen to find a little bit more about your origin story, I guess. Like, how did you get involved in weeds, and like, did you grow up on a farm, or how did you get involved?
Well, I'm more than 2 generations from the farm. So my great-grandfather lost the farm in the Depression. And so, not that it was much of a farm I might add, it was a small dairy farm near Balan. And so, yeah, and a lot of the rest of the background sort of city. I born in Melbourne, grew up in Canberra, got into biology and went to work in the United States on, of all things, biofuels. Did that for a few years and then went, nobody cares about biofuels, but it's never going to go anywhere. I should go and find something else to do. It probably a bad decision at that stage in terms of what the potential was, but we're talking, like 10 years before biofuels really took off. So an opening arrived to come and work on weeds, particularly herbicide-resistant weeds, where I could use some of my chemical and biochemical skills in Adelaide. And so I came to Adelaide for a few years to just see what I could find out about how resistance work, and I've never left. So it was more by accident than design, Nick. But I will say, working in weeds has actually been a really intellectually challenging space. It's one of those wicked problems. No sooner do we think we know what we're dealing with, and then something comes out from left field. So some of the things that we've dealt with over the years, for example, other than herbicide resistance, of course, has been this increased dormancy we've seen in some of our grass weeds due to continuous cropping and systems. And, you're suddenly having to rethink how you do things. So from that perspective, it's been good.
Yeah, I guess one of the things that's always struck me about you, Chris, is how practical you are, how on farm you are, and I guess given your background, that's pretty amazing, really. So I guess over your journey, how has resistant weeds changed?
Well, when I got started in resistance, I like to describe it as being largely an academic pursuit. There might have been 50 to 100 farmers in across Australia who had resistant weeds when I started. And I've worked on them for 30 years, and all I've done is make the whole thing worse. We got more and more resistance. But that's really a function of the fact that farmers use herbicides and they use them well. And by doing so, they put a lot of selection pressure on weeds. And of course, you're going to push weeds towards resistance. And one of the things that I really discovered early on in my career was that it was actually the best farmers who were getting resistance first. And the farmers who weren't as good were way behind. And I used to use this as sort of an opening point at some of the talks I gave, and all the farmers with resistance felt a lot better about themselves. But it is true. I mean, the farmers that are innovating and using new techniques are the ones who are going to break those techniques. And I don't think it matters what we do, Nick. Weeds will always find a way around it. And so that's why we need to have multiple things that we're doing. We can't just rely on one tactic, because otherwise the weeds will get round that.
And maybe before we get on to today's topic, like how optimistic are you about the future of controlling weeds and the farming systems we use?
Well, one of the things that we've done now for quite a long time, maybe 20 years, so much so that mostly I don't get out and do it anymore, is that we do random collections of weeds for resistance surveys. And one of the things I've noticed over the years is that whilst we're getting more resistance, we're finding it harder and harder to find weeds in farmers' paddocks.
Yeah, wow.
So, the good thing is that farmers are focusing on managing their weeds and getting the numbers down, which was something that I, started talking about, maybe in the mid-90s as being one of the things we had to get to, was to try and drive our numbers down rather than just letting a lot of weeds through. And farmers are now doing it. And I think because of it and our ability to do other things, farmers are much better farmers now. They're growing bigger crops. They're making, good profits most years, except when the weather doesn't help us. And overall, resistance is a major issue, but weed problems are probably having nowhere near the impact that they used to have. So I'm quite optimistic about the future. I think that there will be some new technologies that will come. I'm just not seeing lots of them that I look at and go, we can do this on 2,000 hectares in a paddock. So that's going to be our big challenge: is how do we use some of these technologies on our large cropping fields? But somebody will find a way. Somebody will eventually have that thought. Oh, maybe we can do it a different way, and we'll come up with something else, and we'll go, well, yeah, of course we should have thought of that when we first saw the technology. So that's what it requires, and sometimes that's a farmer that does that. I also like to say that most of my best ideas come from farmers, and all I do is show whether they work or not.
Yep. No, very good. It's good wisdom in all of that, and I love the optimism too. So I guess like on today's topic, it's really this season's brought some interesting challenges, and and big parts of the country are, well, it's up to some of the driest starts ever. I know Kangaroo Island, where I'm from, was debating whether it's the worst start ever or the least amount of rain in the first half of the year. But it's just rained now for a big part of the country, and I guess, yeah, I just wanted to chat through with you what a dry start means in terms of what we've used, how it's going to work, and then what we can do about it if anything.
Yeah, well, I think, my first comment about that is that I've been having a, sort of a general positive commentary around our ability to dry sow more crops for some years now, simply because I believe we've now got the tools to do it. We've got, much better pre-emergent herbicides than we used to have. And I think that getting the right mix of those really allows us to take it. Well, can't say take advantage of a dry start, but if we do have a dry start, we can do something about it. And this year, lots of farmers have gone. So we'll see how right I am as the season pans out. But a lot of work we did, particularly when Sakura was coming, is one of the things we were really interested back then, because that, of course, was the millennium drought when things were dry at the start most years. We're interested in issues around how much moisture did we need to get that herbicide to work, and were we going to get germinations of ryegrass without the herbicide working? And eventually, one of the things we did this experiment where we took dry soil, put ryegrass seed in it, sprayed it with Sakura and Box of Gold as a comparison then, and then we gave them different amounts of water. And out of that, one of the things that we discovered was that if you got starting from dry, the amount of water you need, or amount of rainfall you need to get ryegrass to germinate, is the amount of rainfall you need to get Sakura to activate. So we weren't going to get into that situation necessarily where we get a few little dribbles of rain and the herbicide wouldn't activate and the weeds would come through. What instead we found was that if you have moisture and you don't add more after you put Sakura out, so you got moisture underneath that can germinate the ryegrass, then you don't get Sakura to activate, and you got a much better chance of getting Box of Gold to work under those circumstances. So we had this information, and then we've seen this pan out. We've had a couple of those difficult years where we've had breaking rains, farmers have sown, and then we've had 5 weeks of dry weather, and Sakura's always struggled under those situations, and some of the other products have been better. And that was one of the things that motivated us to then be looking at that early post-emergent space with the pre-emergence that ended up first with Box of Gold, and now, of course, we've got Matino Complete in that space, and I'm sure there'll be more products that'll come. So I would, always reasonably confident that if we had the right product mix, the dry start wasn't going to be necessarily the problem for us. What was really going to be the issues was what happened next. So depending on what products you put down, if you put down products that are not as persistent, so you've used Box of Gold or sulfur carb, for example, then you might find that you've lost a bit of that prior to this rain, and they might have even less persistence than they normally have, and they're going to be the problem paddocks for us. Where farmers have used the more persistent products are things like Sakura, Overwatch, Trifluralin, then I think that they're actually going to mostly work, provided incorporation was adequate and ideal. We might see some situations where Trifluralin doesn't work because we don't get enough incorporation because the soil didn't flow as well in some paddocks. And we might have some situations where if you haven't got an even distribution of that coverage over the herbicide, you might have some issues with weeds coming up in places you didn't perhaps think they were going to. So other than that, I think that generally speaking, what I'm expecting is that most of what farmers have done will actually work reasonably well on that first flush. And the good thing about this year, if you want to say there's anything good about this year, is that this problem I was talking about before of those grass weeds getting extra dormancy and not coming up till later. Well, we're going to squeeze all that together now because, our first flush of ryegrass is going to be coming up, in the third week of June now, second or third week of June. So the second flush is not going to be far behind. So our pre-emergent herbicides might get both of those. And then it's going to depend what happens after that. So if we end up with a wet spring, though perhaps the Bureau's got a bit cold on that now, but if we end up with a wet spring, that could be challenging for us because we'll get extra germinations later in the year and our pre-emergents will have run out because they're not going to give us quite the length because they've been sitting there all that time. And so that might be a bit challenging for us. If we get a dry spring, I think it will be fine. I don't think, well, other than we won't have a lot of crop, but, from a weed perspective, I think we won't have a lot of issues. There's a couple of other things that I think come into play as well, because one of the things about our pre-emergence that, particularly with wheat, is that I've been encouraging farmers to sow wheat earlier to take advantage of crop competition with the pre-emergent. And it our trials have just shown it just works. You get that wheat up, the pre-emergent herbicide takes out that first flush. By the time the second flush comes, the wheat's got big, it's starting to cover the ground, and that second flush just never really gets a chance. This year, no matter when you sowed your crop, they're all going to come up around about the same time because it's the rainfall pattern that's going to do it. And so the wheat's going to come up into colder ground and it's not going to grow as fast. It's not going to be as competitive. I don't think this would be a problem so much with barley, but I think it'd be more a problem with wheat. And so I think we'll find that if we do get ryegrass sneaking through, that we won't be able to use that crop competition with wheat in the same way that we have in other years. So that's the other thing that I'm kind of expecting we'll see a bit of it. We'll see some ryegrass come through and it'll quickly get to a reasonable side because ryegrass doesn't care too much if it's cold, but wheat does.
Yeah, so just circling back to one of the points you made about Sakura and activating. So just what I took is that if there was more subsoil moisture and the crop started and the weeds started, but there was no rain to keep it going, that the crop and weeds might grow, but the Sakura would stop working or wouldn't activate.
Well, it wouldn't activate. So if you got one of those paddocks where you did have moisture close to the surface, because you need the moisture where the weeds are, not so much where the crop is, but where the weeds are, and the weeds are quite close to the surface. Certainly, a number of the paddocks that I saw through the autumn, you had to dig quite a bit to actually find any moisture in South Australia. So I don't think most paddocks were going to suffer from that. But if there had been a bit of a rainfall and you still had some moisture close to the surface, that's when we get into trouble with Sakura, when we don't get that extra rainfall on top of it.
Yep.
But, we should have enough rain, probably with what's coming now. If we haven't had enough already, depending on where you're farming, we should have enough rain in this next lot to get us enough moisture to get Sakura working.
Yep, and I think you said that you can control up to 90, like in ideal conditions, you can get 90% of your control of ryegrass with just Sakura over that whole kind of season. Is that right? Roughly.
Well, it varies on what the season looks like, Nick, but we can get quite high levels of control if we've got the right pre-emergent herbicide package. So the sort of things that we've been doing over the years has been, well, we started with Sakura plus Avadex, and that gave us a good chunk of season-long control. But then we had things like, Sakura followed by Box of Gold, and now that we got Matino Complete in that early post, we can do even better if we want to.
Yep.
And I did have some trials with Bayer where we put Overwatch followed by Matino Complete, and that gave really long-lived control. It created a few headaches as well if you got it wrong. You have to be really careful where you got two herbicides that both cause a bit of crop effect to make sure you got them well spaced so you're not donging your crop twice. But you can get really long lengths of control if you need it. And a lot of that, I'm kind of focusing on those high rainfall areas where they need it. But I think, this year, our issue is going to be more that we're perhaps not going to get the length of control that we might normally get out of our products because they've been sitting in the ground. That doesn't mean they won't work, but we might have lost a small percentage just through time or a bit of dew or whatever that's caused a bit of degradation. And I mean, I don't really have a figure on that. We did a bit of work during the millennium drought years where we put pre-emergent herbicides out well in front of sowing. And in those years, if we didn't get rain on them, they worked when the rain came. But I would expect that we've had product in the ground for 6 weeks or more in some situations, and we've probably lost a little bit. So we don't expect to get the same level, same length that you might normally get. And I think that's probably one of the key things to think about. Farmers, I think, should go out and check their paddocks. This year, depending on where you're farming, in South Australia, the Bureau is, all their chat at the moment is pretty much against us for doing really well through winter. They're talking about rainfall in August as being where it's going to be. But, those predictions, of course, are subject to fairly wide errors. But if we do have a dryish winter, then, and you're thinking about, I've got some ryegrass up, what do I do? It's probably a better choice to use Box of Gold or Prosulfocarb as your early post product for those sort of salvage type situations, because we don't get rain on Matino Complete, it doesn't work.
Right.
Whereas we only need 5 to 10 mils on Box of Gold early post, and it'll work. It'll get down there. So I'm thinking that going through the season, once the crops are up, check where the weeds are up. If you've got too many weeds, might be the time to pull the trigger on something like Prosulfocarb or Box of Gold, just to get those numbers down so you don't have those big weed numbers going through to the back end of the season.
Yeah, great. I should just mention there's a chat box that you can drop a question in if you have any questions. Covering a bit of ground pretty quickly here, Chris. And I guess, so that's an option early post, and then, then how do we manage the rest of the season and decision making around, the end of the season, dealing with the weeds then?
Yeah. So, this depends a bit on what crops you're growing. So in the pulses, we do have some tools for the middle of the season. In our cereals, we're just relying on competition. So our choice then is what we do at the end of the season. And we've got crop topping, which is good on some crops. If your market's okay with it, you can use it on barley. Less easy to use with wheat, more challenging to use with wheat. And the other complication we have with that is, of course, glyphosate-resistant ryegrass. So if you've got glyphosate-resistant ryegrass in your paddocks, crop topping is not going to work nearly as well as if you don't. So we're going to get into this space, I think, at the end of the season where things are going to get a little bit challenging for us. Yes, we should crop top some paddocks because that'll help us deal with some of the ryegrass problems we have. Probably more focusing perhaps on our legume paddocks for that, though there may be situations where you want to use it on barley. But the problem with the legumes that, one, they're not going to be terribly competitive because they've come up late, and secondly, they're never terribly competitive. So they're where, if ryegrass is going to get away, it's most likely to do so. So I think and I think the other thing is, just harvest weed seed control is going to be one of those tools where this will be a year where I think a lot of people will go, that's what I'm going to need to deal with those weeds that we can't otherwise deal with.
Yeah, so the herbicides have run out.
China, because we don't have that crop competition, so we've lost one of our tools. So having, we need our herbicides, we need to have crop topping, we probably need to have harvest weed seed control wherever we can.
Yeah. How worried should we be if there is some herbicide resistance to glyphosate about crop topping? Is there ever a case to say don't do it because there's resistance, or should you do it anyway?
I don't think there's ever a case to say don't do it because of resistance, because it's such a useful tool for us. It's just that if we've got resistance, it's not going to work as well. So then you might have to have a backup plan. And certainly, when we were doing our long-term integrated weed management trials, one of the things we did do at one of our trials was to crop top and then follow that up with harvest weed seed control. And that really worked, because we got those weeds at the end of the season twice. So anything the crop topping missed, the harvest weed seed control tended to take the numbers off there. So I don't think you should be afraid perhaps of doing both if you think that that's what's needed.
Yeah, but in general, don't avoid a crop top. And maybe, well, what about just relying on harvest weed seed control?
Well, I think for some of the crops, definitely do that. Wheat would be one where I'd go, I think we're really going to struggle to crop top wheat this year because of our late start, basically, and everything's going to come together in the springtime. And I think it's going to make us challenging to find that space. Of course, it always depends what the spring turns out like. So, that might be one where harvest weed seed control is probably a better option. And you might think about that with barley as well. And certainly, if farmers have been doing harvest weed seed control, then I think the cereals should be more or less a no-brainer in terms of doing that. I think where you might think about, do I just rely on that, would probably be the pulse phase, where if ryegrass does get away, then harvest weed seed control is just not going to pull your numbers back enough because of the big numbers that you might get. Because I don't think, even though we're not going to have a lot of competition from our cereals, the late start probably means that ryegrass growing in wheat's not going to produce huge numbers of seeds. It's just going to be more competitive than normal. But in those pulse crops, we could get some really big ryegrass setting a lot of seed. And I think under those circumstances, harvest weed seed control is just not going to pull it back far enough. And that's when I would think, well, this might be a case of doing both.
Yeah, that's certainly been my experience. At high numbers, it's hard to have the same amount of impact if you've got heaps out there.
Even if you do have the same amount of impact, you've got a lot of weed seeds left over.
Yeah.
So it still looks ugly afterwards.
Yeah. No, so it sounds like I guess it's not all doom and gloom. There's still some positivity. We've missed a few opportunities, but it's like, in your mind, the farming system of dry sowing is still the right way to go.
Well, I think in a year like this, it would be, because, if we're waiting for an opening rainfall, it's more or less just happening.
Yeah.
For us here in South Australia, I mean, it's been a pretty challenging start to the season. And you're then talking about, well, you got to, get on the ground and sow your crops. And if you've got a 3 or 4 week sowing program, you're not going to get your crops sown till the end of July. On that, I was talking with an agronomist this week, and we were reminiscing about 2005, which was somewhat a similar year. And he was telling me that he was looking through one of his clients' old notes, and they were sowing crops on the 26th of July.
Wow.
Now, 2005, at least we had a decent spring. But, I think we can't trust what the end of the season is going to do to us. And if we're not getting crops until the end of July, that might give us 2.5 months of growth before they're going to have to go and flower. And I think, getting an extra month under our belt by having them come up now is going to be really valuable.
Yeah. No, it's good to know. And I think, people listening would feel better about knowing that, for sure. I think I've heard you say before that, changing the mindset around which paddock to seed first. I think you've said now it's probably better to plant your weediest paddock first. Is that fair to say?
Oh, I think so. I mean, that was that was out of some work and a conversation I had with Peter Hooper once, and Peter was reflecting to me that amongst his clients, what he was seeing is when they were sowing early, the wheat was more competitive. And I said, oh, well, we should have a look at this. And so we ran 3 years of trials where we tried to dry sow, and it rained early every year. So we just ended up sowing at 2 dates. And what became really, really obvious really, really quickly was that early seeding, the amount of ryegrass you had in early sown crop versus the late sown crop where you had another knockdown in it was exactly the same. They were just smaller.
Yeah.
And what we recognised was this delayed or increased dormancy we get in our grass weeds was happening in ryegrass. We've gone and documented it now that it does happen. And what that was doing was basically waiting till you sowed to come up. So delaying sowing on a weedy paddock just didn't help because you didn't get any more ryegrass up. And all you did was put your crop in late and had less competition against the weeds that were there. So, 20 odd years of teaching students, sow the weediest paddocks last year and get a knockdown on them and get more weed control before the crop goes in, turn that completely on its head and say, well, actually, if we've got clean paddocks, we want to sow them last because it doesn't matter that our crop's not as competitive in a clean paddock because there's no weeds.
Yep.
And so we probably want to get our weedier paddocks in earlier where we can really make our pre-emergent herbicides work for us and the crop competition work for us. So, that's one of the, we have all these rules and then the weeds change them all on us and we have to set up a new set of rules. But that's one of the ones I think where, we want to change our thinking around it. And I must say it was one of the easiest extension cells I've ever had. Was to talk farmers into sowing earlier because it's exactly what they wanted to do. The bit we brought to that was to get your pre-emergent herbicide right in that. And if you got that bit right, then it worked really well.
Yeah. And is there anything that can be done to bring weeds earlier, or is it just a temperature thing that's delaying the dormancy that's going on?
Well, it mostly seems to be a temperature thing that they tend to not germinate early. So in ryegrass we kind of know what the mechanism is. We're not quite sure of all the things that trigger it, but basically to germinate in a weed you got 2 competing hormones. One starts high, the other one starts low, and over time the high one gets lower, but you need the low one to kick in and get high. And what ryegrass does, it doesn't start that process till later. And we think it's temperature that triggers that to go. And so, waiting for weeds to come up, you got to wait quite a bit of time. We used to have 2 flushes close to the beginning of the season, and now those 2 flushes are about 6 weeks apart sometimes. Yeah. And that's one of the real challenges we've got in the system. And it's because we've got this continuous cropping system and we're selecting for weeds to come up at particular times, and because we kill everything that comes up early, now or we're left with all those weeds that come up late and they become resistant to coming up early. They're like, it's the same as herbicide resistance. It's just in a different format.
Yeah. So, well, where do you see, like in obviously not this year, but in the future, where the knockdown herbicide fits into Australian farming systems? Does it ever get just deleted? Or?
Well, that's been one of the conversations I've been having. So you might have heard I had this little project running a year and a bit ago, where we're looking at, I called it cropping without glyphosate, where we had 2 aspects to that, one of which is, can we make glufosinate work in that space?
Yep. And
the answer is yes, but it's hard and expensive.
Yeah.
And the other aspect of it was, well, what happens actually if we drop the knockdown out altogether? And this was, this thinking about, can we go dry sowing and how do we do dry sowing? And the answer we came out of that was that in a A more normal year when you're dry sowing, you want to have a really effective early pre-emergent herbicide, and you must have an in-crop early post-emergent to back that up, to really make that dry sowing work. And we did a range of, options. It's Carabitex followed by Boxer Gold. We did Triflora Abadex followed by Martino Complete. Of course, we did Overwatch followed by Martino Complete because we could. But we had all of those sort of options in there. They all worked. They all worked in that space. So it was about the strategy you were choosing to use about dry sowing. So I was making sure you had the right herbicides up front. So not your stuff that's too water soluble, not your stuff that doesn't persist long enough. Though I think in an average year, we could probably get away with, some prosulfocarb up front. It's just that this wasn't an average year. And I think it's always one of the challenges where you go dry sowing is you don't know when the rains are going to start. So that was really a focus of saying, well, can we actually take pressure off glyphosate by not using it in the knockdown space? And the answer is, if you have a dry early autumn and you don't have weeds in your paddock, or you've cleaned them out, cleaned everything out early, and you don't have any growth, yes, you can. You can make that work. And so I think that we'll probably look at this a bit more going forward about, what are the opportunities? What are the things you really got to watch out for? Because this is always what happens when you try something completely new, that we don't have a lot of experience about how this is going to work, and something will inevitably go wrong somewhere, and we'll learn, no, we shouldn't be doing that. But so far, what we've done suggests that, yes, as a way of managing glyphosate, it probably can be done. Of course, it's not going to work for everybody, because anybody who gets a reasonable amount of summer, early autumn rain is going to have weeds in their paddock, and you're going to have a knockdown anyway.
Yep. No, it's interesting to see how it all changes. And then I guess on like the end of the season, it's probably fair to say that we should harvest our weedy paddocks first if we are using harvest weed seed control. So
I think particularly if you're using the seed mills, I think that's before you get a lot of lodging and ryegrass shattering out of the head and those sort of things, because it gives you the best chance to get as much in the front. And still the big loss we have is what doesn't go in the front of the harvester. That's still the big loss in that process. So anything we can do to minimize that will help. And we did a bit of work with some farmers around this, and they had some interesting ideas about how we could do it. So one of the things they wanted to try was what happens if you windrow first, and we decided to do it on barley, because back when I started in agriculture, windrowing barley was a thing. Particularly on the York Peninsula, and so you didn't lose all your heads. And so we gave that a go. Yeah, that actually got more ryegrass in the front if you did that, because you were cutting it earlier and putting it in the windrow. But in fact, what the farmer in that paddock was doing was that whenever he got to a ryegrass patch, he just dropped the front down as low as he could. And then when he got out of the ryegrass patch, he just lifted up again. And that was, a flat paddock, so it really, you could do that. But that actually worked better.
Yeah.
Just on the patches, just on the bad patches, just trying to get the front down as low as you can for those bad patches. Spend your time in those. And his attitude was, well, it's only probably 20% of my paddock that I've got a problem in. And so I can cut at normal height in 80% of my paddock and just take the edge off the ryegrass. And I can spend the extra time in that 20% of the paddock that needs it. So, just some good different thinking about how to achieve it. So I think there's more than one way of doing this, but I think you're right in your original question, getting into those paddocks early before the ryegrass seed's gone, so you can get more of it in the front.
And then if you do have a bit of a blowout, like is there is there a rule of thumb to cut some for hay or bomb it out, or because the next year is going to be so bad?
Well, yeah, I mean, we've talked over the years about bad patches of cutting for hay or doing other things, and farmers have done this. They've had areas in the paddock where something's just gone wrong, and so rather than let the weed set seed, they've just cut that area for hay and then harvested the rest. And I know farmers who've done got wild oats and have done some sort of spot spraying where the wild oat patches are, and those sort of practices. So I think it depends a bit on how much you're willing to actually have to deal with this in future years. And certainly now that we've got a few new tools, it's the incentive to do this on smaller problems is not there, because we can pick up some ryegrass in some crops with crop topping. We've got harvest weed seed control that we can use to pick up some of that ryegrass. So I think people are now thinking about that being mainly a target where you've got those really bad patches, where you're not actually probably going to get a lot of crop out of it anyway. And so instead of letting all that ryegrass seed go to the ground, getting rid of it, making sure it doesn't by killing those weeds early.
Yeah, and like you said earlier, it sounds like we, as an industry, we've gotten a lot better, and there's probably not as much of that happening.
Well, I think say more tools help us. Mean that we don't have to do some of these things, and then there's always other things. Agronomists I know in Central Victoria, and I think some of the people online will know who I'm talking about, said to me that actually one of the best things for ryegrass management for him has been the amount of frost they've got, because if they get a crop frosted, they just cut it for hay. They've got a dairy industry nearby, so canola in particular. They cut that for hay. He said it just cleans up the ryegrass like nothing else because it's been cut so early. And he said the big thing about it is making that decision early, so you get the best quality hay. But when you do that, you just take all the ryegrass out. So, you can take advantage of other things that happen to get some weed control if you need to as well. So we do have a whole range of tools, and we need to use as many of these as we can.
We've talked a lot about, I guess, seaweed and spray weed or managed weeds, but is there any way that we can just bomb them out altogether and have so little that we don't talk about weeds anymore? Do you ever see that in the future?
Well, look, I'd like to get to that, because that'd be my pathway to retirement. We're not talking about weeds anymore, and look, maybe that technology will come. We're seeing quite a few new technologies come out, but when we get to that, I think it's going to be more about robots. I think that's going to be the game changer for some of these things that we might do, where we get to the point where we're going, we don't actually have to worry about what weeds are doing now. Unfortunately, I can't really see us having a robot that's going to go around and individually treat every weed in all of our paddocks, because there'll be too many of them. But if we, for example, had a system where we put our pre-emergent herbicides out and they did the first 6 weeks of control, and then the robots went out and just dealt with the survivors, that would make it a much smaller weed population. And if there's no time limit over this, so they don't have to get them in 2 weeks or whatever, it could go on for 2 months to actually control those weeds, then you've probably got a potential where you'd be able to kill every weed in the paddock. And so we might come to that. We might come to something like that, but I think it'll require something like a robot to do that. I don't see any other space of technology where we could put something blanket over a farm and kill all the weeds without causing other problems like killing our crop.
Yeah.
But there's lots of work going on alternative weed control methods. I think what we've got to be thinking about is which ones can we actually use and how are we going to deploy them.
Yeah, I think you might have a whole other career ahead of you by the sounds of things.
I think there's some exciting stuff out there. We just haven't worked out how to use it yet.
Okay. Where do you see the I guess the more patch management type technologies coming along? Do you see them really fitting in?
Well, I think that this is where, that's the sort of things I've been talking about will come in, to be managing those bad patches. So your normal management's dealt with the weeds everywhere else, and you've got just this bad patch. I know when Sam Trengrove was a postgraduate student with me and very interested in patch management of weeds, we did all this stuff. We worked out, we got to identify patches. They didn't move too much from year to year. You could create a case where you might put a cheap herbicide over the whole paddock and expensive herbicide on the patch, only for Sam to find out that actually what farmers wanted to do is to put the expensive herbicide over the whole paddock as a bit of insurance. So I think you need to have something that's going to give farmers confidence on the rest of the paddock.
Yeah.
So this is why I'm thinking about, we'll do something, manage the weeds over the whole paddock, and then we'll have another technology that just comes in and deals with those patches or stray weeds or whatever. And so the farmers will go away with confidence that their weed management problem solved for that year. They won't lose yield over this, and they can employ something else that doesn't actually involve them having to do anything in particular, would be the best one. So if they don't have to go and drive something, that'll be even better.
Yeah. Hopefully we see it. I guess one of the interesting points there in that is like, and I guess you see it very different perceptions, but one farmer's perception that a bad weedy paddock is someone's best paddock, and that's how the decision kind of gets made. Is that have you ever dug into that, like how decisions get made about when to spray or not spray?
A lot of that is around farmers' attitude to things like risk, cost, and other things, and it depends sometimes whether farmers are really forward thinking, or whether they're just kind of managing from year to year or just over a couple of years as to how they might approach some of those problems. I think one of the things that resistance has done to a lot of our farmers in Australia is made them much more forward thinking, because they've been there. They've known how hard it is to come back from a big resistance problem. It's having the weeds get out of control. It could take you 3 or 4 years to get back from that, of hard work. So they know that, if it does get out of control, that's what they're facing. And so they do seem to be a little bit more tempted just to go a little harder so they don't get into that space. Whereas you do have other farmers who've got a different attitude towards these things and are willing to say, I can fix that next year. I'll have something that'll solve that problem next year. I won't worry about it too much this year. So a lot of it, I think, boils down to personalities and, the type of farmer you are. There are farmers I know who, I've had farmers tell me, that they just don't want any ryegrass on their farm if they can avoid it.
Yeah.
And other people who are quite comfortable with a smattering of ryegrass to all of their paddocks, because they still feel like they can get it under control. And sometimes what I think is probably too much ryegrass, they're perfectly happy with. What I think we get to is that if you're happy with big numbers, you're always going to have big numbers.
Yep.
And I think that's been the bit of trying to change that perception. If our farmers' intention is to make sure they've always got small ryegrass numbers. There was one person said to me once, one ryegrass plant is one too many. If they've got that attitude, they will keep the numbers down. If they've got their attitude, it's okay, I can have a bit, I can deal with it later, they'll always have bigger numbers. And it means that when problems do occur, they'll be much harder to manage. But it's a bit of a personality thing. It's about how people feel about these things. And there are some farmers that you just can't change. You can't get them to deal with something that they don't see as a problem.
Yep. Yeah. But in in large, do you think we get it pretty right?
I think we get it pretty right. I mean, I travel a lot around the world, and you'd have probably seen some of this as well. And I go to countries like the US in particular, and I look at the farmers in the US and what they're doing, and I compare them to the farmers we've got in Australia, and our farmers are just way ahead.
Yeah.
In terms of innovation, attention to detail, focus on problems and all that sort of stuff. They're just much better farmers. And I think in the long run, what that's done is actually paid off for our farmers, because, they're producing, as I said, they've got higher yields now than they've ever had for wheat. And a big chunk of that is agronomy.
Yeah.
Agronomy's driven a big chunk of that. And so by getting the agronomy right, they've actually put a lot of money in their own pockets. So I'm pretty confident with, that we'll get these problems, and I think our farmers can manage them. We just need to get the right tools in place, so that they've got things that they can do with some of these problems. And so, some of them are going to be a bit challenging. I mean, glyphosate and paraquat resistant ryegrass in a knockdown situation, that's not going to be easy. So we're going to need a tool, but I think we'll do it.
Yeah. Yeah, fascinating. We talked about ryegrass dormancy within the season, but what are you seeing from like season to season, and how's that changed over your time?
Oh, it's changed quite significantly. So if you go back to all the old papers, they talked about 5% carryover of ryegrass between seasons, and we know it's 20-25% of ryegrass carries over. So doesn't germinates the next year, and that's when we have those years where we get those big seed sets that they trail through for several years afterwards. Yeah. And we don't just see a big ryegrass population the year after. We might see it the year after that. So we're always ending up, when we have those blowouts, now having to manage really for 3 years instead of 2 is probably where we've got to. So it's just, just more complications. But I think the thing about knowing that that's happening means that we can be prepared for it. We can, we can look and say, well, in our rotation, we don't just need one crop where we can really manage ryegrass. We need to find 2 to put together. And so what are those crops going to be? What works for us? And this is the, the thinking that eventually led to the idea of the double break. That particularly in the higher rainfalls, they used, though one of the agronomists down there tells me they're not doing it anymore because clethodim doesn't work. So they're they're now relying on wheat for a lot of their ryegrass management. Just shows things can change quite quickly. But it's we've got to have 2 crops where you got tools that you can get a lot of weed management. And I think that's the bit that we need to be looking at. And when we lose one of those tools, we either shift in a different crop where we got tools, or we find another tool. And that's, I think, where we're going to be with weed management into the future. We're always going to be looking out for these new tools. And when they come, how do we best use them, and where do we best employ them? And you'll know this, of course, through the seed mills, having been through all that process with the seed mills, that, there are now ways that we can make them work better than when we started. And some of that's been about the engineering, but some of it's been about the timing and how you use them.
Yeah, definitely. We're finding that farmers are thinking about it well ahead and planning ahead, and double knocking lentils is a good example of really making it work really well. And there's I see people bringing the windrows back too, or the swathers, if you're in other states. But yeah, I mean.
Look, I mean, anything that can get more ryegrass is going to help, in any part of our rotation, in any part of our system. So, that's where we want to try and bring those things together, and really make them complementary. Of what I'm really thinking of. So I'm looking at, how can we control as much ryegrass through the season, so that the harvest weed seed control's only got to do a little bit. That little bit at the end, which then complements everything else we're doing, and we get this kind of synergistic effect instead of, well, we'll just let the ryegrass go and we're going to fix it with our because we've got a seed mill and we're going to fix the problem with that. And I'm going, well, it's not going to work that way. All you're going to do is have a big problem. So just getting all those pieces of the puzzle together, I think, is what's really going to make it work. And our farmers have been pretty good at that. And I think that this is why they are such good farmers, is that they are thinking about, how do I put things together? How do I make all these moving parts of that system work?
Yeah, and it's probably one of the more, like I sort of, I'm with you. I've travelled and think the Australian farmers are some of the best in the world. And, I guess the sentiment that we hear a lot from particularly our customers is that they really want to leave the farm in a better state to the next generation. And so they are thinking, okay, well, this tactic might not make me money this year, but over the long term, it'll make me money. And not only that, I'll be able to hand over a farm to the kids that, has low herbicide resistant, low weeds, and can grow good crops. So it's pretty inspiring, really.
Yeah, I'm still inspired by Australian farmers. And I don't lose too much. I mean, they probably lose more sleep than I do over weed management issues. Because I think that sometimes it might be a matter of time, but somebody out there will come up with an idea. One of those farmers will come up with an idea, and we'll hear about it, and we go, we really should try that, and then affect the idea and make it work, and then the farmers will be able to use it.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating. I love your attitude. I think it's pretty refreshing, really, Chris. In the weed science community, I'd say it stands out. There's a lot of doom and gloom, and herbicide resistance is going to destroy the world, and we'll go hungry. But I love the positive attitude.
Yeah, well, I think I've seen herbicide resistance as being a challenge more than a disaster, and it's about, how do we find those little things that help us on its way, and and some of the things that we've done over the years, understanding that when we got FOP resistance, clethodim still worked.
Yep.
I mean, how much of a difference that made to farmers when that not just worked on a few populations, but on most populations. So you could almost say to farmers, "Oh, just use clethodim."
Yep.
When they had a problem, and that made a huge difference to things. And I think the work we did in the pre-emergent herbicide space, not just about finding products, but finding ways to make pre-emergent herbicides really work.
Yep.
So going from 70-80% control to trying to get 95% plus season-long control, and just that, I think that different attitude that got brought in there with that changed the way farmers in Australia view pre-emergent herbicides. They have a completely different thought process about it, and they're not willing to put up with second best. They want products that really do the job for them in that pre-emergent space.
Yeah. So just before we wrap up, if there's any questions, just drop it into the box here. But I guess bringing it back to this season, Chris, like your maybe just give us your highlights or your key points, key takeaways.
Oh, I think that now that's rained, when you get out after the crop and ryegrass starts to come up, do actually have a good look at your crops. And if you do have any paddocks where there's more ryegrass coming up than you'd hope to see, it's probably pencil those ones in for an early post-emergent spray if you haven't already planned that for that particular crop. And then as we're heading through the season, I think just recognise we're not going to get that benefit from competition in wheat that we normally get. So what is your end of season plan going to be? How are you going to do it? How much control are you going to need, and get yourself organised for that, because if you don't get yourself organised early, it's not going to happen. And ultimately, hopefully, we will have that spring that the bomb's promising us, and everybody will have some good crops to harvest, and we'll have kept the weeds at bay for another year.
Yeah, And anyone that's not doing harvest weed seed control, Chris, what should they be doing, do you think?
I think they should be stepping into harvest weed seed control. This, you know, if you've thought, I don't need it, I don't need it, I don't need it, this might actually be the year where you need it.
Yeah.
And I think, as I've said a number of times to you, Nick, I think the most important thing is just to get into it.
Yep.
And then, you know, find out how to work it for yourself on your farm, and then work from there.
Cool. Well,
even if
you know,
even if this year, even if this year you just do a couple of bad paddocks to start with.
Yep. Start somewhere. Well, I think we'll wrap up there, Chris. But thank you very much for joining us.
Well, no, that's it's been a real pleasure having this chat, Nick. I mean, it's been very wide ranging, and it's not normally that some of them go like that. So it's been.
Yeah, I have to admit, I was a bit nervous when you said you weren't going to do a presentation. I was like, oh, what are we going to do? No, it's been good, and I've learned a huge amount from you, as I always do when I hear you talk. So thanks very much. Okay, thanks for setting it up, Nick. And you know, good luck with the season. And I got some more ryegrass still to count, I've seen. Yeah, plenty more where that came from. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Okay, bye. Bye.